It is a tremendous honor to welcome Professor Timothy Jackson. He is the professor of music theory of the University of North Texas. I was introduced to him by one of the show's previous guests, David L. Bernstein, the founder of Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the author of Woke Anti-Semitism. So, how you say it to him, Tim? Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Tim. So, what would you like to discuss?
The agenda I have in mind is cancel culture and music theory, two
Yeah,
very distinct subjects, but two in which you have a foothold on. So let's
unfortunately, yes.
let's begin at the first one. So tell me about your encounter with cancel culture.
Well, to be honest, I didn't even know what cancel culture was. Um, I I was introduced to all of these things as a result of something that I published in a journal of Schenkerian studies that I produce at the University of North Texas. There was a speech given by another music theorist at a conference that attacked Heinrich Schenker, who is regarded as one of the most important music theorists of all time. He was an Austrian Jewish music theorist who lived in Vienna, and he died in 1935. He developed a kind of methodology for analyzing music that is really quite powerful and has revolutionized our understanding of musical structure. He was kind of the Einstein of music theory, if you will. And so, to cut a long story short, I started a center for Schenkerian studies at my university and established a journal of Schenkerian studies. And after this professor, his name is Philip Buell from Hunter College, CUNY, gave a very harsh attack on Schenker, claiming that he was a racist, and that his racism was embodied in his music theory. I decided with a number of my colleagues and students to publish a symposium of opinion pieces about responding to Ewell's charges. And so we solicited responses from Schenkerians as well as people who were supportive of Ewell's position. And we published those in an opinion piece, a collection of opinion pieces called a symposium. We didn't ask Ewell to respond specifically, although he did receive an invitation along with everybody else in the music theory world to participate, because we felt that it was strange for someone to respond to themselves, so to speak. But we did ask people, and we got pros and cons, and we published those. And I also wrote a con. I wrote a critique of Ewell's position, and I can go into more detail about why mine was particularly attacked, and why I, in particular, why I was the focus of a cancellation effort. But anyway, we published the journal in March. It appeared it appeared in July of 2020, and that was just after the whole Floyd episode in America. And shortly after publication, the symposium was attacked vociferously by Ewell and his friends, and resulted in the Society of Music Theory, which is sort of the society for my particular field, issued a condemnation, which was signed by about 1,000 scholars. And also the students at my school, the graduate students, organized a petition to calling on me to be fired and for the journal to be closed down and investigated, and so on and so forth. So the then provost, her name was a woman by the name of Cowley, decided to heed those calls. She couldn't fire me because I have tenure, but she did everything short of that. Let's put it like that. And she organized a ad hoc committee. Ad hoc is a very interesting term because what it means is there's no precedence for it. There's no legal, there's no grounding in any kind of university procedure for such a thing. And she interviewed all the people that she could find that were critical of me and so forth. And she also had me interviewed. It was like the 16th century Inquisition. And then they issued a report based on their investigation. But unfortunately, their investigation was fatally flawed because there was no compulsion for people to tell the truth. And so they published this on the web, and it contains all kinds of falsehoods and misrepresentations, which amount to a kind of defamation. And so I hired a lawyer and I decided to fight back. And so I held the university accountable for what they had done to me, because supposedly in this country, we are allowed to have academic freedom and academic free speech. And what they did was they basically de facto shut down the journal. It hasn't been published since that time. They removed me from its editorial process. And they basically removed me from all governance at the College of Music where I teach. I was ostracized by most of my so-called colleagues and subjected to all kinds of abuse in various ways. So I sued them, and I sued them on 2 counts. One is for violation of my freedom of speech and of academic freedom, because not only is freedom of speech supposedly guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States, but it's also enshrined in the charter of our university, which states that professors are granted the freedom to speak their minds about matters of great importance for their own fields. That's actually enshrined in our own charter, in the university charter. So they violated that, according to me. And they also defamed me. So I sued them on 2 counts. And what happened next was that we presented our case before the federal court, which has jurisdiction in Texas. And the judge in the court agreed. He wrote an opinion, a 44-page opinion, saying that I had what's called standing to sue them for those two things. They appealed. It's kind of unusual to appeal like at the very outset like this, but they appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is 1 step below our Supreme Court here. They appealed, not disputing the charges, not saying that they hadn't done what they did, but claiming that that I had no right to sue the trustees of the university. In other words, the Board of Regents, because I was saying that the Board of Regents is the ultimate authority over what the university does. So if the administration in the university does something illegal, I'm saying that the trustees who supervise the university are responsible for what happens, for everything that happens. And what they said was, you can't sue the trustees because, number one, they're not directly responsible. And number two, it's a public institution and they have a certain kind of immunity. So the Fifth Circuit Court made a very important decision here. They said that, yes, I can hold them responsible. Yes, they are the ultimate authority. And so I do have standing to sue them. So that is exactly where things are at present. Is now we're waiting for the court. The case has now been remanded. That means returned to the lower court, the lower federal court of Texas, and we are going to presumably go to trial. In which case there will be a jury trial, and we will be suing them on both counts, defamation, and also, perhaps even much more importantly, violation of academic freedom and freedom of speech. So that's in short, that's a short history of the cancellation that occurred in 2020 and its consequences.
Mhm. Well, I wish you the best of luck with the legal process going forward. I understand that
Yeah,
it's
it's been
very
a
long.
long haul, I have to say. Things move very slowly in the law. We probably won't have a trial until, I think, a year from now, maybe. I don't know how long this will go on, but it's a very long process seeking justice. But the more I would say this, that the longer and the more stubbornly they fight this, probably the more, let's put it this way, that the greater the punishment will be down the road. That's what I would like to say. Yeah. In other words, they rather than admitting that they did something wrong and apologizing for the defamation, they want to fight it. And I think that the ultimate result of that will be that the consequences will be more extreme.
Now, Philip Ewell's piece is titled Music Theories, This White Racial Frame, and
Right.
it's published in that same journal that you cited. So tell me about the summary of his argument and how did you respond to it?
Okay, so now we get into the meat and potatoes of the academic and sort of historical issues. So when Ewell first gave his presentation, to which I issued my first response, he argued that Schenker was a white racist, and as such, he expressed his racism and against Black people in America. And because of his influence, he was guilty of the paucity of or lack of many Blacks in the field of music theory. So I pointed out that Schenker, as an Austrian Jew in Austria in the 1920s and 1930s, was actually persecuted and was the subject of anti-Semitic attacks. And there's no way that Schenker was, a pro-Nazi ideologue, as Ewell claimed. And also, Ewell assumed that Jews are necessarily white. And this became clearer as the argument progressed, because after I pointed out that Schenker was Jewish and that had very important consequences for his legacy, Ewell pivoted somewhat and he said, well, that doesn't prevent Schenker from being a Nazi. He was just a Jewish anti-Semitic Nazi. And so what I did was I went back to the sources, which are extensive. Schenker kept a diary, which is 6,500 pages long. And it was miraculously preserved, like many of Schenker's other papers, during the Holocaust. And only recently has it been translated and transcribed so that people can look at it online. But the gist of the argument is this: Schenker Schenker was, as a Jew, was persecuted, and he was subjected to anti-Semitic slurs. And in his diary, he talks about his love for the Jewish people, his faith in God, his feeling that he is a religious Jew. And all of this contradicts Ewell's claim that Schenker was anti-Semitic and that he was not, he hated the Jews and so on and so forth. It's absolutely ridiculous, that he looked down on unassimilated poor Jews living in Vienna. That's nonsense. He he Ewell doesn't have a grasp of history, in my opinion. He has no control over the historical facts. He completely misrepresents them tendentiously in order to make a really ridiculous argument that has no factual basis. And that's another problem that we're having in academia today, which is where people, for ideological reasons, they falsify the historical past. They want people to be different than what they actually were in order to prove a point. So that was my response to Ewell. And I also, the other thing they didn't like was that I contextualized Ewell's attack on Schenker, because what I said was that Ewell wants to blame Schenker and Schenker's students and Schenkerians for the problems in music theory. And since Schenker was Jewish and since many of his followers were Jewish, this has an anti-Semitic resonance. And I also pointed out in my initial piece, in my initial opinion piece, that there's a real problem with anti-Semitism in academia and also in the Black community in America. And Ewell, of course, didn't like that at all, and neither did his followers. But I stand by what I said. There is a problem with anti-Semitism, and we're seeing that now even more clearly than before October the 7th. There's a huge problem with anti-Semitism in American academia. And it's for that reason that Ewell's attack on Schenker was very welcome to a large portion of the music theory community, because they've been influenced by this kind of thinking. And they didn't like that. Of course, they didn't like that. And that was probably part of why they wanted to cancel me.
So I've had recurring conversations with thinkers who've had their ideas canceled. I believe the most recent one being Nigel Biggar, who wrote the book on British colonialism and British Empire.
Yes, I know
And
him. I know of him. I don't know him personally.
yes, his book is wonderful. I would recommend it to
Mhm.
anybody who's listening. But I sense that there's something peculiar about these last 10 years within the realm of academia, where ideas like Ewell can, obviously because of academic freedom, can be widely disseminated and widely discussed.
Mhm.
But for people who rebut these currents of ideas like Ewell's, they get severely punished or
Right.
severely censured or reprimanded, whatever word that you call it. So, what is the peculiar feature of these last 10 years that caused this phenomenon to be so?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and obviously the problem exists in all fields now. It's music theory is just a small corner of the much larger picture, and this intolerance for non-ideologically determined argumentation. That's what it really is. Looking at the facts and following them where they lead, right? As opposed to having a very strong ideology and trying to make the facts fit the ideology. This debate, as you say, has been become extremely heated in the past 10 years. And perhaps it goes back, though, further, I think, in academia.
We can return now. So
Okay, it's like a cancer that has been metastasizing very slowly, and more terminal phase where it's actually becoming much more serious and metastasizing more quickly. But I think that the roots of this go back at least to the 1960s, and certain left-wing, even Marxist ideologies of the 1960s that now have resurrected themselves in a new form. But the roots are there, going back to the earlier period. Also, it has to do with Black nationalism in the United States, and this is something that a lot of people don't want to discuss because they're very afraid of being called racist, as I was. I was called racist for bringing that topic up. But it is a topic, and unfortunately, there is a long history of Black radicalism, which is also associated with anti-Semitism. And that too has metastasized, in particular institutions. So Hunter College at CUNY, which is where Ewell teaches, has a history of, let's say, anti-Semitism in it. And CUNY has a history of that as well. And that has metastasized over the past, let's say, 40 years, and now has resulted in CUNY being branded the most anti-Semitic university in the country.
wow, let's see. So I do understand that. I'm not sure to what degree our City University of New York and City College of New York are similar entities, but
Well, City College is one of the colleges of the City University.
yes.
There
So
was, so maybe I could name some names. There was a professor in the Africana Studies Department at CUNY whose name was Leonard Jeffries, and he was there in the 1970s, 1980s. And he and a number of colleagues around the country, especially at Ivy League schools, came up with this idea that the Jews were especially guilty of the slave trade. And this also intersected with Farrakhan. We have a man by the name of Farrakhan. You may have heard of him.
Louis Farrakhan, yes. Nation
Yeah,
of
Louis
Islam.
Farrakhan, who's virulently anti-Semitic. And one of the things that Farrakhan did was to organize and produce a book about how Jews were responsible for the horrors of the slave trade, and how they were also responsible for many of the ills or the evils that were perpetrated upon Blacks in America. And so this was given academic legitimacy by professors like Leonard Jeffries around the country, and resulted in controversy in the 1990s. And that controversy continues to this day, and certainly it's related to this whole issue with Schenker as well, I'm afraid. So they didn't like that I brought that up. And in fact, there's a woman by the name of Jasbir Puar who has written a book called Right to Maim. And this book argues on the basis of falsification and just, what is it, defamation, that soldiers in Israel were told not to shoot to kill, but to maim, so that organs could be harvested from Palestinians. and used for organ transplants. And her book, Right to Maim, was published unbelievably by Duke University Press. And in my article, in my original opinion piece, I cited this as well as evidence of how anti-Semitism has permeated the discourse in Ivy League schools, especially, and how Ewell's argumentation fits well within that context. And she was one of the people that signed the petition against me. So you can see that there is a lot of overlap and intersection, to use their favorite term, between these various aspects. And there was another aspect that they didn't like about my opinion piece. So Ewell claimed that Schenker, hated blacks and said that they couldn't govern themselves and so forth. The truth is much more complicated and different than that. But anyway, that's what they claimed. And I wanted to argue that Schenker's love for classical music did not prevent him from appreciating Black spirituals, that he really liked what he had heard of some African-American choral music. He said it was better than some of the most famous German composers of his time. So, in other words, Schenker did not have an inborn prejudice against blacks or black musicians. That's absolutely false. And I wanted to also point out that Ewell, who valorizes, in other words, who thinks that that rap music and hip hop music should be studied in the university setting and should be valorized, in other words, raised up, he had not one word to say about the problems with rap and hip hop music that have to do with both anti-Semitism and misogyny. So the problem of rap and anti-Semitism is now well known. I mean, there are many famous rappers who have come out openly, making anti-Semitic claims and comments. It's a real problem. And the other thing about it is that rap music contains a lot of anti-woman poetry, where women are made into simply, they're denigrated as sex objects and not given any kind of, dignity. And I pointed out that he said nothing about this. I have pointed that out, and therefore I said that to valorize rap and hip hop over classical music to some degree, I'm not totally against that, but I feel that we have to discuss these other aspects and not just insert these elements into our curriculum, because we'll be inserting anti-Semitism and misogyny into our curriculum at the same time. And I was very much against that. So that didn't endear me either to my critics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I suppose if I can look at things from Ewell's point of view, at least from the perspective of that essay of his, the reason why I think hip hop music has gone away with so many anti-Jewish, anti-woman prejudices is that for Black Americans, they believe that represented the authentic voice of the marginalized folks of America, so to speak. And the reason why they denigrate classical music so much is that they see it as, well, a manifestation of whites. Well, they would, many of the more anti-Jewish Black Americans would say that Jews are white people, and go on from there. But it stems from this rather childish Manichaean view of white versus Black and oppressor versus oppressed. So
Okay, so if you look at me carefully. I do look white, don't I? I have white skin. But if you looked at my sister and my father and my mother, they actually are much darker than I am. They all have black hair, and their skin color is actually closer to yours. And the reason is that the Jews racially are very, very mixed. And I look white and I had red hair as a kid. I've lost a lot of it, unfortunately. But I had red hair as a kid. And I took after my mother's side of the family, which there were people with red hair and white skin. But the fact of the matter is that these people, in their one-dimensional view, do not understand that Jews are not racially unified, and they're not all white. If you go to Israel, for example, you'll see black Jews. You'll see from Ethiopia. You'll see Indian Jews from India who look like Indians. The majority of Israelis are much darker than I am, and that's because of their Sephardic roots. They're Arab Jews, basically, right? So many of the Jews in Israel look like Arabs, and in fact, many of them speak Arabic and can even pass as Arabs, right? So the idea that Jews are white and that they belong to the oppressor class is really not borne out by the facts, okay? And second of all, and this was my point with Schenker in Vienna and also Jews here in America, is when I was growing up, okay, I'm 65 years old, so I'm an old guy now, right? And I grew up in a small town it's called Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, all right? And when I was a little boy, my mom said to me, you know, Tim, you're Jewish, you're not white in the conventional sense. And one day my mom said to me, I said, I want to go swimming with my friends in the country club. My mom said, you can't go there. You're Jewish. They don't like Jews there. You can't go to that swimming pool. Okay. And in Canada, there were signs that said no Jews or dogs allowed as late as the 1930s, late 1930s. Can you believe that? No dogs and no Jews allowed. All right. That's how Jews were regarded in Canada. Now in Austria, things were much worse, especially as Hitler rose in Germany and the Austrian Nazis began to increase in power, right? So Schenker encountered all kinds of anti-Semitism. So to say that Jews are white and that they are necessarily part of the privileged class and the oppressors of the poor blacks who are oppressed is absolutely ridiculous. And yet this argument has been trotted out time and again, especially now, by people like Ewell and his followers, to justify blaming the Jews for all the problems in America, all right? Which is a form of anti-Semitism, I think.
Mhm. Yes, and there frequently enough, I do hear that these voices, so to speak, when they encounter the charges of anti-Semitism, they would push back by another, unfortunately, anti-Semitic trope that, as in, you have the media conglomerate and the heads of newspapers and academia um, who all have Jewish last names, as well as advocacy groups like the ADL. They call anything anti-Semitic to silence marginalized voices and such.
Hmm. Well, let's again look at the facts. So, for example, the New York Times, which was owned by a Jewish family for generations, actually was responsible for downplaying the significance of the Holocaust. There are a number of studies academic studies, scholarly studies of how the New York Times essentially not quite withheld, but poo-pooed the reports of what was really going on with Hitler and the Jews during World War II. And today, I feel quite certain that in many ways the New York Times takes an anti-Jewish position on many matters. And the idea that just because, let's say, some or a few executives happen to be Jewish does not mean that they are necessarily pro-Jewish. In fact, we see groups of Jews, very left-wing, radical Jews like J Street and so forth, who take positions which are antithetical to Jewish interests, in my view. So the idea that there's a simple correlation between somebody's ethnicity and their positions is also not true. And furthermore, as if that's not enough to discount that argument, then there's the other point that that Jews control all the levers of power, and that they that they have the, let's say, control over everything that happens. Of course, that's the elders, the protocols of the elders of Zion, where we know this was a forgery, and of course it's not true. Even though Jews have achieved prominence because of individual Jews, because of their skills and their competencies and the amazing contributions they've made, that's not a simple one-to-one correlation, right?
Yes.
It doesn't mean that Jews control the whole world just because there are prominent Jews who've made major contributions to civilization. Let me ask you this. So when you go to the dentist and you get a filling, how would you feel if there was no way to numb your gums?
Extremely painful, I suppose.
Right. Now, the person that invented that was Jewish, happened to be Jewish. He was a German Jew who invented that. Okay. Does that mean that Jews control the world? No. But does it mean that you benefit from that discovery by a Jewish scientist? Yes, you do benefit.
Well,
right?
Of course. I certainly hope that we are not starting a discussion on dentistry, because that's not a field that I know anything about.
Yeah, but it's true, and in fact, this argument came up during the Nazi period because there was a guy who pushed back, a Jewish guy who pushed back against the Nazis, saying, you claim that we control the world and that we're a negative force in the world, and what he was saying was that Jews have made major contributions to every branch of science and the arts and so forth, and that's a great benefit to civilization and to mankind, right? So stop it. don't keep attacking the Jews.
Now, this is a question that I'm very curious on anyone who who is enthusiastic about classical music as well as being a Jewish like yourself. What do you make of Richard Wagner?
That's another long discussion. So Schenker hated Wagner, by the way.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And he hated Wagner for several reasons. One reason was that, of course, Wagner was an anti-Semite. And I'm sure that Schenker hated him for that reason too. But Schenker accused Wagner of not being able to think organically, that he put all of his ideas are in the foreground of the music, like right up front, at the very obvious way, at the surface of the music. And he considered that to be superficial, and he thought that Wagner wasn't able to hear larger spans of structural spans. I think that's nonsense, actually. I think Schenker was wrong, unfortunately. Schenker was right that Wagner was an anti-Semite, right? And that's significant, and that it does have an impact on his music. Um, and I think Wagner's music is like cigarettes. You should put a warning on the package. You know, this music, especially certain pieces like Parsifal, for example, contains anti-Semitic. If you imbibe this music, right? If you smoke this music, then you're going to get some anti-Semitism in there with it. All right. So the packaging should have that, but the music is great. I mean, there's a reason why Wagner is such a major force. I mean, because he was a great composer, and his music does have that internal coherence on an especially large scale, actually. But Wagner was kind of taboo for Schenker, and I think Wagner's ideology, poisoned Wagner's music for Schenker. Schenker couldn't get past that, really. Although in the very early phases of Schenker's development, he wasn't as caustic, he wasn't as nasty about Wagner as later. But for most of Schenker's career, most of his writing career, he was really anti-Wagner. Okay. But you see, there are a number of composers like Wagner who were anti-Semitic and who did put anti-Semitic ideas into their music. So another one is Richard Strauss.
Oh,
And I've done a lot of work on Strauss. And I would say that Salome, for example, does contain quite anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews, and builds on certain tropes, social tropes about Jews. And later in life, this is something that many people don't fully appreciate or know all the facts about. Strauss was involved in glorifying Nazi ideology, and that's a very serious thing. And his reception has tried to downplay and conceal that, but the truth is that during World War II, Strauss wrote music for the Nazis, and he collaborated with the Nazis. He placed his art in their service, and also he collaborated very extensively with the Japanese fascists. That's a fact that's not real well known. Is that he wrote music for glorifying the Emperor of Japan, and that's not good either. So he was very, very deeply involved in Nazi ideology. And another composer who unfortunately shares that role is the Finnish composer Jean Sibelius.
yeah.
And I've written about this too, and it's a major issue now too, I think, and a problem that a lot of Finnish scholarship and scholars do not want to admit that Sibelius collaborated with Nazis and also helped to promote the idea that the Nazi regime was a cultured regime and therefore concealed its dark underside, you know, the Holocaust and all of that. So in other words, both Strauss and Sibelius collaborated with the Nazis to use classical music to hide their brutality and their crimes against humanity. Now, they didn't do it, let's say, with full knowledge of what was going on, although they did have they had an inkling of what was going on, but they nevertheless went forward and did collaborate. And so their music too, unfortunately, especially Strauss, not so much Sibelius, because Sibelius had stopped composing by the time that, you know, World War II was in full swing. He had been working on an Eighth Symphony, which I fear was related to his pro-Nazi ideology, but he burned the score eventually. So the music that Sibelius wrote, which is popular now, was mostly composed before that phase in his life. So it's not connected. But Strauss continued to compose and actually wrote several pieces to glorify the Nazis, and that's a problem. And the Japanese, by the way.
Yes. So going
Probably more than you wanted to know, but
Mhm.
there, in other words, there's a really close connection between classical music, so-called, and Nazism. And the Nazis were very keen to exploit classical music to push their ideology forward and justify what they were doing.
Mhm. Yes. So going back to Yule, I suppose from my very limited knowledge of classical music and music theory, there is a very tentative connection between anti-Black racism and classical music. That connection has to be forced in some way for that to happen. But the connection between classical music and anti-Jewish prejudice is very clear. Now,
Some classical music,
yeah,
very, I mean, compared to the whole,
yes,
well, maybe not. It depends how you define them. There's anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which are slightly different.
mhm,
I would say, for example, a lot of the Bach passions are anti-Jewish. They're what I would call supersessionist. I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
please explain to me.
So, so supersessionism is the idea that all the laws of Judaism are superseded by Christianity, by Jesus's proclamations and pronouncements. Um, so, for example, the whole of the Old Testament needs to be revalued or even rejected because of certain things that happened in the New Testament. And therefore, the Jews have not gotten the message. They're blind because they don't see the truth of what Jesus has proclaimed. And that idea is very deeply entrenched in a lot of Christian music, and including Bach's Passions and Handel's Messiah and so forth. But I would not call that anti-Semitism. I'd call that anti-Judaism, because it's not the same thing, really. And it doesn't mean that a person is against the Jews per se, right? Probably Bach hardly knew any Jews. As far as I know, I once looked into this. Leipzig, which was where he spent most of his life, didn't have Jews because they weren't allowed to live in Leipzig. Jews were excluded. Can I mention one small autobiographical detail?
Oh, please do.
So you might wonder about my name.
Yes.
My name is Jackson. My grandfather, his name was Yakov Zelechin. And so he changed his name when he emigrated from Russia to England to Jack Zelechin, Yakov Jack. And in 1936, my grandfather realized that my father and his brothers, in other words, his children, his sons, might not have a very good career if they kept the name Zelechin, because there was still a lot of anti-Semitism in England at that time. And so he decided to change his name officially from Jack Zelechin to Jack Jackson. And that's how, when my father was 11 years old, he went to bed one night as a Zelechin. And the next morning, he woke up as a Jackson.
Hmm.
My father was a bright little guy, and he was the only one of five brothers who was able to go to what was called a grammar school. And at that time, grammar school, he got a scholarship to go to a grammar school and learn how to speak English properly and write properly and all of that. And so he was able to eventually to go to university. And so as Anthony Jackson, that was my father's name, he was allowed to become something in British society, which might have been much more difficult had he kept his original surname, Zelif.
So going back to the example of City University of New York, it is staggering for me, and I think horrifying too, that anti-Semitism seems to be predominant amongst the educated class of college campuses. I'm not sure about what's the state of that in your university. Um, I hope that's not too bad, but
No, it's been a problem here too.
oh, so
We had a department, we had a department called the Department of Israel and Jewish Studies, which was established about 20 years ago by one of the history professors here. And a few years ago, about now it must be 5 years ago, he was forced to take the Israel out of the title. He had forged connections between our university and certain universities in Israel. And our provost, under the same, well, the same provost who attacked me, attacked him, and he was forced to drop the title of Israel from the Israel and Jewish Studies program. And he retired not too long ago, and he had been attacked by our DEI department for criticizing a guest speaker who supported the Palestinian cause. And so they had launched an investigation of him using their DEI department, which they've now been forced to close down because the government of Texas has said you can't have a DEI department anymore, and you can't use DEI in making hiring decisions anymore. And they've also stopped. We were forced to take all these trainings in DEI, and that has ceased because the government intervened and said you can't force professors to do that anymore. But yes, there has been a real problem with institutionalized anti-Semitism at UNT. They've covered it up. They've covered it up, and a lot of the Jewish professors at our university were afraid to complain or say anything about it, but it occurred. I know a lot of this because I used to teach in that department. I offered a course on Judaism and classical music in that department, and I also offered another course on the representation of Jews in opera. So I taught two courses within that. I haven't done it for several years now because the department has been gutted as a result of all of this. Yes. So the answer to your question is not only has it taken over in all the Ivy League schools, but also in my little school here, it has happened.
yes, so going back to my point is that for for some reason it has been predominant amongst the educated class.
Right.
And for say anti-black racism, people think that it is a prejudice held by lower class whites and their grifter politicians, George Wallace style.
Mhm.
For anti-Semitism, it seems that throughout history, not just even today, some of the most educated, the most enlightened minds held these prejudices.
Mhm. That's very, very true. And it's not new also. I mean, you're right. So for example, I have a letter uh, from a dean at Columbia University from before World War II, in which he writes to another high official in Colombia, complaining that he's forced to hire an emigre Jewish scholar for a certain position because there's no Aryan to fill the position. So Jews were not welcome in academia in America and in many other places too, for over a century now. And there was an explicit or implicit bias against hiring Jews to teach in universities for a long time, and there were quotas for the numbers of Jews who could be admitted. So there's very clear evidence for what you're talking about. But what I find, like you, what I find absolutely mystifying is why that has persisted to this day, when I would say that we've made a lot of progress in avoiding other kinds of prejudice. But then you look at what's gone on at Harvard recently about the admission of Asians to Harvard, right? So they basically, what they were doing was very similar to what they did with Jewish students. They wanted quotas. And the fact that, let's say you have an Asian student who applies to Harvard who has an extremely high score on the SATs, or GRE, let's say, and they're turned down in favor of somebody who has a much lower score on racial basis. And I find that also very hard to swallow. And so I was very supportive of the Asian society that took a legal stand against that and actually won in the Supreme Court. And now that too has influenced a lot of what's going on in academia. Now we cannot do that, cannot distinguish students on the basis of race anymore. So they're trying to, of course, the quote unquote woke administrators are trying to find workarounds. They're trying to find ways to do what they've always been doing without, running afoul of the law. But I think it's becoming more challenging for them to do that, and we'll see what happens. By the way, they accused me of racism, my peers and my colleagues and everything. My wife is actually Asian, she's Korean, and my children are mixed race. They're half Jewish and half Korean. So I guess, and most of my students, let me say this, are Asian, because there's a huge interest in classical music in Asia. So I have most graduate students are either Chinese or Taiwanese or Korean, and I've had a few Japanese students, not as many as the other groups, and also Chinese and Asian American students from America, second generation, third generation students. So they don't seem to think that I'm racist. So that's if we go to trial, I think that might be a little bit problematic for the opposition to prove that I'm endemically racist. I'd like to mention something about Black students. I have had very, very few Black students. I've been teaching for now professionally for 35 years. And over that time, I've had really only a handful of students who are Black. And I'd like to mention one in particular, because I think when I wrote my initial response and I was thinking about my experience with Black students, she was very much in my mind. I'm not going to name her, but she was somebody that made an impression on me. So I had her in one of my technical classes teaching counterpoint. And she told me that she was from a very large, very poor family, that she had a lot of siblings, and she came from a poor area in Dallas. And her family knew nothing about classical music. In fact, they knew nothing about a lot of things. Okay, so that it was she came from a very weak background, but she was very intelligent. She was super intelligent, and she was super curious and inquisitive. And she told me that she had discovered classical music in her first year of university, and she was absolutely fascinated by it. So she only took one class with me, but she used to come by and see me quite regularly, and we would eat lunch together sometimes in my office and just talk and talk. And I would say to her, look at these paintings, listen to these pieces, read this book, read that book, right? And she would do it. She would actually do it. And then the next time we would meet, I would tell her more, and she would go and do that. So she was one of I would say she was the brightest Black student I've ever had. And then she said, well, I said to her, well, oh, the other thing was that she was really interested in Schenkerian analysis. Okay. She wanted to do it. She was very interested. She was fascinated. And she said, well, I'm thinking about what to do for grad school. And I have to be careful because I don't have any money. So I have to earn a living, and I have to, I have to support my family. My family has very poor, and I have to earn money, right? So she decided to go into an arts management program. So she got into a very prestigious arts management program in Washington, and she worked. It was a good program for her because it was very small, and they were able to place their students in management positions in the arts as part of earning the degree. So it was kind of like an apprentice degree experience. And so she was able to earn money while studying and while getting her master's degree. So she did that, and she was successful. And then a few years later, she wrote back to me and said, I've never stopped thinking about all of our discussions, and I kind of regret that I didn't, go into a doctoral program in music theory. And I'm wondering, what do you think? Should I perhaps give up my job and go back to school and do a degree in music theory? And so we talked about that. And she said, send me your writings and, give me a sense of how the field stands now. And I did. And she thought a long time. And eventually she decided not to do it because she said to me that she just couldn't take a chance on giving up her job and, going back to school, and that the field also seemed very difficult, and, not many opportunities and so forth. And so she decided not to. But the point, you see, that I made in my article, in my opinion piece, that they didn't like was I said that many Black students do not grow up in families where classical music is cultivated. And that has been my experience, is that, for example, in her case, she only discovered her love for classical music as an undergraduate student. And in many, many ways, that's just too late. You, you, if you want to be a professor of music theory, you have to start playing an instrument when you're 3 years old, or by 5 or 6, you really have to be playing, and you have to have a teacher, you have to have an instrument, your parents have to make you practice. you it's a huge investment. And Ewell, for example, his father apparently was a black professor of mathematics, and his mentor in university, Ewell's father's, was mentored by a Jewish mathematician who was an emigre, like some of Schenker's students. Okay. And another thing that really upset me was that Ewell publicly criticized his father for loving Bach and for really loving classical music. But what I would say to Ewell is your father gave you the opportunity to become one of the few Black professors of music theory by making you play the cello and by giving you lessons and by loving classical music so that you heard it when you were a kid and giving you an environment in which classical music was valued. And that way, it was possible for you to have a career. But for many Black students who don't have that background, it's never possible to go back and fill in the gaps as much as is needed. It's just not practical. And so that was my point. And my point was that the parents have to prioritize the study of classical music from an early point in the child's life so that the child can develop the competencies that you need to get into various programs, right? So you can't go to Yale unless you can play your instrument. You can't get a degree at CUNY in music theory unless you can play the piano, right? And so I had piano lessons from the age of 6. My parents were very, very supportive of me playing classical music. I went to Juilliard prep school when I was a kid on a full scholarship. But that was only possible because my parents had, put forth great time and effort and money to support that. And here's one other thing about money and about lack of privilege. Okay, so here's the point: is that my mother grew up during the Depression, and my grandfather was a peddler, a Jewish peddler. Okay, he and my grandma could barely put money on the table. My parents grew up, both of them dirt poor. Okay, they had nothing, almost nothing. And my mother told me, and I have a photograph of my mother as a little girl holding a violin. Now, my grandparents had nothing, but they decided that my mother had to have violin lessons and had to learn how to play the violin, come hell or high water. The story is true in my family that my mother told me that sometimes they didn't have enough to eat. Sometimes she went hungry, but she always had violin lessons. You see, it's a matter of priorities.
Well, on that note, we've unfortunately run out of time, but thank you very
Yeah,
much, Professor Timothy Jackson, for joining the show.
thank you.